growth. Welcome to the show, Kim.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
So, in a nutshell, please explain to our audience exactly what you do for organizations.
So, right now I'm VP of People at Walker Advertising, and we work with roughly 400 attorneys all across the United States. And our company has actually been around for almost 40 years. We were founded by a court reporter in LA who recognized that folks who came in who spoke Spanish, maybe English was their second language, they were getting hurt. They didn't understand the legal process and they were kind of getting lost. So she started an informal network of Spanish speaking attorneys to help connect folks. And it just blossomed into this big business in LA. And then it's kind of gone across the United States. And so it's kind of unique to be in this position of HR, but also trying to partner with my company and talk to folks out there about discrimination and harassment, and really I'm kind of coming at it for two places. On one, I really want to fundamentally change HR and how we can support diversity, equity, and inclusion, how we can reframe the profession to be one that protects the employee in order to protect the company, and pull away from kind of these traditional spaces where all the laws were written by outside employment attorneys designed to protect the company at all costs, avoid litigation, and avoid risk. And then on the flip side of that, to help more people access attorneys for free so that they can get the help they need. Because I just truly believe, and I know there's studies out there that support this, that millions of people are hurting with this issue. There's still an
Mhm.
enormous amount of discrimination and harassment that are going on in our workplaces. And anything I can do to help, bring that about, bring about a quicker end for that is, I'm definitely here for that.
Wow. Wow. That's exciting stuff, really, especially now in this climate that we're in.
Mhm.
How did you first become interested
So,
personally?
I had the good fortune to kind of learn early on from these really great people, and then, left on my own and ran shops on my own where I was in an environment like that, where I was walking into the environment that were extremely different, where there had been abuse of power that had gone on for very long periods of time. And so, I ended up in positions where I'm the first person in somebody's life ever saying, hey, that's sexist. You can't say that. That's racist.
Mhm.
That's not okay. You know, here's the penalties. This is what can happen to you. And that message wasn't always well received. And so, working through the emotions of that, and helping people kind of build back that trust, and putting integrity in that space again, the way it should have been, was something that was like, very challenging, but also extremely rewarding. And then I ultimately came up to a point where it definitely happened to me, where I was reporting up to a chief executive who was just, I mean, there's so many words. I'm trying to be careful on which words I can use to describe this person. But one of the most difficult people I've ever worked with in my life, and and I never knew who I was going to get. Sometimes you get a happy person, sometimes you would get, someone screaming at you, and
Mhm.
so you were just always walking on pins and needles. And what was really interesting is I was the head of HR, and I was honestly kind of at a loss for what to do,
Mhm.
because if it was anybody else, I'd open an investigation, but I couldn't do that through my own shop. It would look tainted, and so I really didn't have all the options that kind of other people had. And so, I reached out to other leaders in the organization, and it was just, oh yeah, that's been that way forever, and
Mm.
that's just how it is here. You're not going to fix that. And I'm like, that's not okay, And
Mhm.
then I met alone with the board and said, you have a huge problem here. And they were same thing. Oh, we've known about this for a very long time. And I was like, okay, look, this isn't good. This is pretty serious stuff. But I think sometimes you see in these cultures where something goes on for so long, they don't recognize the world has changed. The law has changed. Courts have changed. All this other stuff has changed. They're like, well, we've just gotten away with it forever. So why not now? And so I had to figure out something really kind of on my own, and I started having to document, engage her directly. It was challenging because in these moments, I definitely felt like I was going to be fired at the end of it. I felt like I was unprotected. I kept asking for an outside investigation. I almost had to back them into a corner with that, where I kept having to point out very specifically, hey, look, these are our company policies. She's violating them. She's an employee too. Hey, we called in hundreds of people and investigated them for less things than she's done here. So can you explain to me in writing why you're not following our own policy and practice? And then I finally got, okay, we'll investigate. And the investigation went on for quite some time. And then they kind of do what they'll typically do with executives. They'll say, okay, we opened an investigation. We sustained allegations of abuse. They actually put that in writing. But we hired an executive coach. And so we consider this matter closed. So,
Mm, wow.
and I think part of the reason why they'll do that is because if they admit more wrongdoing than that, then that's a lawsuit. And so the system is almost incentivized to downplay what is happening for a highly visible employee at the expense of others, because they don't want to have to pay for something. Um, and I will say that they did. I hired an attorney at that point, and they still had to pay for something, and that just becomes a basis for the next claim to be even larger because there's more of a record and more of a record of them not responding.
Interesting. Very interesting. So you have a personal stake in making sure that this happens. So, but you wouldn't say, or at least what I'm hearing from you is that yes, you are an employee advocate, but you're also an advocate for the company so that they don't fall into these pitfalls um, that are sort of there uh, just as part of business operations that eventually you're going to have some disagreement or whatever, but how you handle that um, is really what you're trying to help companies with as well as employees. So my next question is also what would you say are some of the most common misconceptions about the Office of Human Resources? I mean, I've worked in many different organizations, and I say this a lot, is that it seems like they are really focused on policy, on human resource policies, and policies that have been generated, obviously, as you're saying, as a result of legal advice from employment lawyers. So, and how to get away with not paying unemployment insurance for that person. And,
Yeah.
it seems like that tends to be the focus when it really shouldn't be. And so how do you respond to that question? What's some of those misconceptions about what HR can do, what they cannot do for the employee?
I think, I tend to see two kind of broad buckets, and it's a little bit of an overgeneralization, but, you know, I see a lot of HR shops out there that just aren't trained or prepared. In some ways, I wasn't trained or prepared, that I had to kind of figure that out on my own. But I think there's a lot of, smaller companies in particular where HR is the afterthought, like, oh, we need somebody to process paperwork and host birthday parties. And so they're bringing somebody in who's just not equipped to deal with some of that really hard stuff. But I have found that by and large, those who are trained, they have really dedicated themselves to this profession. They want to help more than people realize.
Mhm.
But I've even been in these situations where somebody has come to me with a complaint and I can't appear tainted in any way. My job is to be objective as possible. And if I show bias at any point in that, interview or anywhere along the road, it taints the outcome, which doesn't do any favors to the person who is filing the complaint. And so sometimes HR can come off as kind of cold and clinical, but internally, they're usually aware, like, oh, I know this person is a huge problem, like, and they already have an idea of how things are going to go. They've heard rumors or they've seen things, and they're just waiting to try and build up that case to actually protect people in ways that they may not know. So I hope that brings comfort to some folks when they're engaging in HR, in terms of what it looks like. It may be more helpful than it appears. But I also think what a lot of people don't realize too is how much retaliation HR professionals face. I've faced enormous amounts of it. I think some of it is gendered. HR tends to be a woman dominated field, and most of them are reporting up to CEOs,
Hmm.
CFOs,
Hmm.
board members who are still overwhelmingly white men who get just as scared as other folks when they're accused of something, who may not have that lived experience of, feeling like they've been treated unfairly, and so aren't as sensitive as they can be. So, HR really has to do a good job of managing up, because sometimes, like, if you're coming in and you're like, hey boss, you know your best friend down the hall, the high earner, the top salesperson, whatever it is, that you and your family are good friends with, we have a complaint on that person, so how are we going to
Hmm.
walk down that road? And so it gets very tricky, and it can get very political, and there are some places that try to rip things out of HR's hands. There's some places that will punch down at HR. I've seen HR chiefs who've advocated for employees and have been demoted and have been fired. And so um, those things, rarely make it out into the light of day, but privately, there's a lot of HR folks, I think, that, are really struggling and trying to do the right thing. And that's why I think as a profession, we really need to do better to support folks there.
Yeah, that must be a very hard tightrope to walk because of who that person is usually reporting to, and
Mm-hmm.
so on. Is really interesting. So, one of my burning questions with every HR person I talk with, I get different responses. Some of them I think are interesting responses in a sense that there's a tendency to blame the employees rather than to reflect on perhaps something the organization might be doing to perhaps cause employees from leaving and quitting and quiet quitting and outwardly quitting and just quitting.
Yep.
So, what's your take on why we are experiencing, really pretty much in other countries as well, this quiet quitting, this outwardly quitting, this people just leaving their jobs and being very fed up um, with work environments?
I think it's because our system is unfair. It's terribly unfair. And I think the pandemic really shined a light on a lot of cracks in our systems. Um, in the US, like, childcare is abysmal, and the demands we place on working parents, can be just downright impossible. And when you look at wages and how they've stayed relatively flat for 40 years,
Mm.
and then you're looking at executive pays and companies, and that information is out there and it's public, and employees are seeing that people are getting very wealthy off their efforts, but then they're still kind of struggling to get by. And yeah, I think that's kind of the undercurrent for a lot of that stuff, and there's no shortage of things, I think, to point to right now.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think you're spot on with that. There's just so many things happening that employers need to address in order to begin to stop this leaking of employees. So, wanted to ask you in terms of the employee as well. What should an employee do if they have gone to an HR person and they have a problem and they feel like you're not helpful?
Yeah. And that can happen, my goodness, that can happen. you know um I actually wrote like a series of articles. I can send you links on that too, if that's
That'd be great.
helpful
Yeah.
for you at all. So I always recommend kind of a 5-step process for folks that are going through that. Some steps are scarier than others, so follow as much as you feel like you can do it. So but I think the very first thing you do is go back to the policies, as you pointed out. And so everyone ignores their employee handbook. We're all handed it. No one cracks it open or looks at it. But I actually like to ask folks to go back through and look, because everybody, because of EOC requirements, they have to have some language in there, about harassment, discrimination, and to go copy and paste that and keep that in a document. Anything in there that speaks to that, any public policies. And what you're basically using it, you're using their words against them. And it's a very powerful place. It puts HR on the hook. And you want to think about, whenever you speak to HR, you're not just speaking to HR, they're talking up. And so you're effectively arming them too. So, if they're more of an employee advocate and they're trying to be helpful and really resolve something, they can go to the boss and say, hey, this person is quoting our own policy. That is so huge. People don't realize like how gigantic that is, because in those quiet backdoor rooms, what ends up happening is they judge their next steps based on how you present yourself. And if you use their words, they're going to pay attention to that. So they're going to see you as essentially a more serious problem that needs to be addressed. I also recommend that you keep a log for yourself. And this can be something that you don't necessarily have to share, but it is so important if things escalate that you have documented throughout. So don't leave that to chance. Even when I'm dealing with like an employee issue or something happening myself, I have an open document that's just a live document, and I'll go in there and I'll write, 6/21/2023, 8:22 a.m. This person said X. These were the witnesses in the room. I don't add a lot of color. It's very just the facts, ma'am. And I do that every time there's an incident. So you just start keeping a log. And this does two things. It creates clarity in your mind, because this stuff gets very emotional. And so if you do have to ask for help, you want to be succinct, you want to be clear, and this can help you kind of structure and organize your thoughts. It's also very powerful in the HR world, and that ups the ante, so that if they see that there's a written documented log, if they're afraid of action and trying to avoid you, it might make the hairs on their neck stand up a little bit more. So you become more serious in their world. And then go ahead and write the letter. If you're going to communicate with HR, I actually don't think you should ever do it by phone. There's a lot of people who do that. I've had people who were so afraid to make a complaint. One person I'll never forget came to my office, and she had like written by hand what was happening on paper, showed it to me, and then took it back and tore it up. And so I wanted to help her. I desperately wanted to help her. She was in that much pain that she felt like she needed to do that. But I need more than that to work with. If you have an HR person who's not working with you, putting it in writing puts them on the hook. There is now evidence that your employer has been notified, and you're upping the stakes. I think it's really critical, too, that when you write a letter like this, you cite the company policy, you cite the times and dates that things happened, and then you also just say how it's impacting you. You don't add color, you don't add emotion, but you state very clearly in there that this is causing you harm. I also think it's a really good idea to file with the EEOC. If HR is not working with you, then take it outside of those company walls. You have far more safety out there, because EEOC will come investigate on your behalf. They can't run from anything. It really changes that whole conversation. So if they're not investigating, if they're not following up, or you're afraid they're investigating in a tainted way, which happens, taking it out of their hands can be a good way to escalate, and it communicates that you're serious. All that can be pretty scary, but if you do those things, you're actually more protected at any point from then on out. If anything negative happens to you, if you're demoted, you're moved, anything, it can be perceived as retaliation, and that also ups the ante. So I do think that there's more tools in people's toolboxes, but HR may not tell you that, or your company may not tell you that.
Well, I think it's very interesting that you say that, because the same things that you're saying, leaders, being in leadership, having been in leadership for many years, we are trained to do that. To keep all the things, the advice you just gave, we are
Yep.
trained to do logs. We are trained to look at the policies and see which policies are being violated, in order to bring, if we're having problems with an employee and why we're having problems with them. We are trained to do that. And so my next question, it really is, and I've known people who have gone to EEOC, and it really depends. I think it depends where you live. It depends what state you're in. It's very difficult to, how do you distinguish with employee from the employee side? Okay, so looking at it from both sides, from the employee side and from the organizational side, that how do they navigate and begin to understand, how do they distinguish, like you said, between what is a policy and how that policy is being interpreted.
Yeah.
And then also the legal side of it, that whatever is legal in the state. Now, in different states, in probably the majority of the states, I once read, because just dealing with employees over the years, you just get to know these things, right? That in many of the states, to terminate someone without cause,
Oh,
is the
yeah.
law. So you
Yeah.
really don't need a reason.
Yeah.
So in many states. So how do you navigate that way from both perspectives?
Yeah, so no, I mean it's a great point, and I feel like I should probably say that I'm not a lawyer, and I
Oh,
don't want to
sure.
suggest that I can offer legal advice, but that's part of the reason why it's good to contact one. I mean, every state has an employment attorney. A lot of folks will speak to you for free. Sometimes you can just kind of give them what is going on, and they'll let you know, like in our jurisdiction in this place, this is the best informal advice. Like California, for example, one of my best pieces of advice, go through the state versus EOC. There's a lot of states that will have their own Office of Civil Rights, and they'll behave very differently than the EOC. Some of it is a little bit smoke and mirrors too. So I know some employment lawyers who only file with the EEOC because that lets them go to federal court. So they like to come in, and that can be very scary for employers. And so it changes how you negotiate from there. But I have seen in a state like California, the state office appears to be better funded in some ways than EEOC. And so they have a reputation for actually being more involved and more forward leaning and very proactive. And so it does swing wildly from place to place. But having that record early on, as much direct evidence as you can possibly get, so if you have text messages that you've saved, if you, have anything that goes beyond just, a he said, she said situation, but
Hmm.
anything that you can find that can support you can potentially help. And so if you are in a situation where you've raised a complaint and you feel like they're firing you because you raised this complaint, it's really important to not sign off on anything, to make sure that, you take a minute to review kind of what's in those documents, to go out there and get some sort of opinion, and to let them know and to bring that direct evidence with you, so that you are empowering an attorney to, seize that moment and make that case for you that, this action took place and now you're doing something negative to the employee, and it puts the employer in the position of now defending that decision.
That's good. I think that's good advice. And part of it too is that I have seen in situations, like I said, I've been, an adult working for
Mm.
over 30 years. And so seen many, many different situations. And I have also seen a situation where nothing was done. Someone went to EEOC, nothing was done. But as a result of people coming after that person, then that person sort of, there's a track record now that, listen, there's a problem here because this is not the first person that has reported, an incident. And usually when there's one incident, there's usually other incidences that they can refer to. So that fear of saying, well, nothing's going to be done, it may not be done in one person's case, but once that person builds a track record, something eventually is done.
I wholeheartedly agree. And even in my own case, where everybody's privately saying, oh, this has happened forever, but nobody would make an official complaint. And, there was even someone who came to me to complain. And I said, you understand that by law, I'm legally liable if I don't respond to what you're saying. And I sent an investigator to meet with them, and they refused to say a word on the
Mm.
record. And so, but once I came out on the record, 40 other people did. And so sometimes it just takes that first person to do it. Um, and I see that actually pretty frequently because now people feel like, oh, okay, it's not just my head on the chopping block, or maybe my words will be buried in there and they won't figure me out. But it creates a little bit of safety for folks.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have another question for you that I just kind of, I had not prepared, but I'm just thinking, as you're talking that what about this whole thing you're saying like don't say that because that's racist or don't say that because that's sexist. What is this whole idea? And this really plays into where we live and the politics and the political environment that we live in. What about these accusations of cancel culture? Don't say that, don't do that, because and leaders and people who are supervising others are feeling sort of out of place, not really understanding that things have changed. And like you said, years ago they used to do, especially because of course sexual harassment was the big thing at one time. Okay, now you have to go through sexual harassment training. You watch this video, and the leader has to get to understand. But this is particularly when, like you were saying, more women are in the workplace now, but that still has not seemed to deter those of different age groups
Yep.
from doing what things that would be technically called sexual harassment. So my question to you is what are your thoughts about this whole thing about cancel culture and people's complaints about that there's too much sensitivity.
Well, I think there's a couple ways you could go about it. I mean, my personal view is that protected characteristics are protected characteristics, and there's the law, and everyone deserves to feel safe at work. And so, if someone was to, I don't know, throw that complaint at me and saying I'm overly sensitive, I'm okay with that. I mean, it wouldn't faze me personally. I would say yes, and I'm very proud of that. This is my integrity. This is how I treat people, and I am very happy to stand by that. And I think it's really important to look for those leaders. If you're out there looking for a job, because every job spec these days say, oh, we care about diversity, equity, inclusion. But
Hmm.
ask in the interview, what do your numbers look like? Talk to me about your leadership, your board, like, do you really, like, is there something there? Because that will eventually send signals up that they can be losing great talent because they're not truly engaging in the space. And I think that there is a lot of opportunity for the gentleman of a certain age he was used to particular things, to build bridges with those folks to kind of speak their language, and there's so much more that we have now. Performance metrics have come so far. And so we now have ways to say, okay, you've got a nightmare executive, and maybe this person brings in $1 million a year, but the 12 people that they work with are so miserable that they're probably working at 50%. So take 50% of their salary and just throw it in the garbage because they're looking for other jobs or quiet quitting. They are so miserable, they're trying to avoid him. And then if they're supervising folks, that triples down even further. And so by framing it as you're really hurting the company's performance at a high level, sometimes that message sinks in a little bit differently. But I also think the stakes have never been higher.
That's
When
true.
yeah, I mean, like,
Hmm.
every week you were seeing a jury award, $366 million awarded to one
Hmm.
person on race discrimination, class action suits for 213 million. I mean, these are huge numbers. You know, addressing a jerk is free. Like, going to court is horrifyingly expensive. And even if you win, it's, I mean, you're going to be writing a giant check. And so hopefully messages like that, can resonate with folks who may not be feeling it, that the damage that they're doing for other folks is real.
Yeah, that's excellent. You mentioned before in some of the notes that I saw when I was looking at your bio that HR has a complicated relationship with sexual harassment. What do you
Hmm.
mean by that, and how, and explain?
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to the what we were just talking about a minute ago with so many women working in HR and that power dynamic of reporting up to chief executives that are men. And so I have seen in these instances where they kind of endure sexism and perpetuate it at the same time. And a lot of that's driven by fear. So if you ever run into that HR person and you've made a complaint and they go, "Oh, you know, you probably don't want to go there. Is there another way that we can resolve that?" And they're trying to push you away from that complaint. All that's really telling you is that they are too afraid to engage up.
Mm,
And and then that retaliation piece, where they haven't earned the respect of whoever is in their leadership. They're not seen as a peer, whatever that case may be. They're not in a position to advocate for you. And so a lot of times whatever you have in HR is a direct reflection of what you have at the top of an organization.
absolutely. That's why they
Yeah.
picked them.
Yeah. Exactly right.
I mean,
Yeah, if
it's
they
just,
picked them. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's just probably human nature.
Hmm.
You can anticipate and expect that, and I guess that's why a lot of employees, that trust factor is missing there between employees and HR professionals. Um, just wanted to ask you, get back to the fear factor. Talk to me on both sides of the hats that you wear. So you're advocating for the employee, you're advocating for the leader, who's the HR leader, who's trying to resolve a problem or resolve a conflict. Um, Explain to me, how does the leader um, deal with the fear of, perhaps they know what's right, and they know that the situation that the employees, perhaps explaining what is actually taking place and what the relationship dynamics are between the two people, but at the same time um, afraid because the CEO has a very different take, or may have their own biases, whatever.
Mhm.
And say, it's not sexual, it's race discrimination. How would you approach both sides?
So I think, for the employee in an environment like that, 99% of the time they are scared. They're in a power imbalance, and they're on the bottom end of that. They have the least amount of information. People may only go through this process once or twice in a lifetime, but your employer is going through that constantly. So they're far more informed. And
Mhm.
in a lot of cases, they're even trained by outside attorneys to catch people, and the process can be very slanted. But if at all helpful, everyone's afraid. Everyone's afraid. Your boss is afraid. The HR person can be afraid. The outside attorneys are never afraid. They're getting paid no matter what. But there's a lot of fear on all sides of it, and so sometimes that can be helpful. I think HR folks and really good leaders, caring leaders, should talk more openly about that fear. In those
Hmm.
moments where I've been protected, I was absolutely terrified in some of these moments. And I think it's really important to say that out loud because there's nothing wrong with it. What matters is that you're still going through with whatever you need to go through. And things I would tell myself in those moments, was if I'm standing here and I don't say anything, and I know this is right and wrong, like, what am I doing here? I shouldn't be in this job if I'm not equipped to figure out how to move forward with this. And, in some cases, I've had good allies. Sometimes you can have like a great corporate counsel or someone so that, the two of you are approaching someone and it kind of amps up the seriousness, of now the attorney is sitting here saying this is not in your best interest to ignore this. This is how big of a check you'll be writing, and using some of those arguments. If you're alone, and I have been in those spots too, and you're just 100% convinced you're going to be fired at the end of this, and you can go file a complaint and go down that long road and everything else. But, for me as a single mom, I remember just thinking about my child, thinking about what's going to happen and all the things we worry about. And in some of the worst ones, I actually remember one time where, you know, I wrote an email from the office, saved the draft, waited till I went to my car, hit send, and drove out of the parking lot. And I don't even care about, like how that may look for someone else. I figured out how I needed to do it and I did it and I got it out there. And then I did whatever I needed to do. I got on my elliptical machine. I burned off the stress. I showed up at work the next day and I said, let's have a conversation. So be honest with where you are. It's okay wherever you are. I think by owning that fear, it empowers us to figure out how to move through it.
Mm, that's good. I think that's great advice. But to understand too, it's an emotional, emotions play heavy into that. And
Mm-hmm.
I have met people too that have been actually traumatized,
Mm-hmm.
seriously emotional trauma as a result of a toxic work environment. So it really does. Mental health is another piece there that I think people don't consider because of all the things you mentioned. Their situations, they might be a single mom, and I can't quit this job, or I can't just make that kind of a decision. It not only affects you, but it affects your whole family.
Absolutely. But I think you also raise a really great point there, that if it is affecting your health, you need to go to the doctor immediately. You need a record of how it's
Mm.
affecting your health, because that is absolutely significant, and you may be able to get a workers' comp claim out of that. It can be something too where that doctor says you need to take time off and they have to give you FMLA because you have a legitimate illness. I mean, that can open up, other protections for an employee when it reaches that point, because you're absolutely right. It can be overwhelmingly terrifying, which is so important to, figure out how you're going to manage self-care, you know, whether that's eating a bag of M&Ms or working out or whatever you do to bring yourself peace, and those detailed records, so that in those moments when that fear kicks up, you've got something to hold on to that's concrete and devoid of emotion.
It's other thing that I was wondering if HR departments are really prepared for, in terms of rapid change in society and what technology has done. It's been some good things that technology has done, is like you said, the performance standards and so on help us to understand what is happening, and how to make decisions based on key performance indicators, and all that's great and wonderful. But my question is with AI coming fast and furious, um, and the fact that it is going to replace a lot of humans in the workplace, what are HR professionals thinking about, and what recourse does someone have who has been replaced because of, some sort of technology advancement?
Yeah, I know. I think it was just yesterday the EOC put out guidance on how they're tracking closely how AI is affecting hiring, and that there are a lot of biases and things to be concerned about. From the very structure. And I'm not an AI expert, but from what I understand, in terms of, like, they're pulling everything from the internet, which already has some issues in terms of, like, it's not the best space where women are treated well, or minorities are treated well. So, there, if that's the starting point, we have to figure that in somewhere. And then you're also seeing too, where they were talking about, places in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia where they're paying people very little amounts of money to kind of go through and scrub data, and in order to try and clean up that end product that can come out when you ask ChatGPT to do your homework or write a letter or whatever.
Hmm.
And so on one hand, I think it's kind of a mixed bag. HR can be like a very heavy admin position, and
Hmm.
so by eliminating some of that admin, I actually see a normal, or kind of a great potential, I think, there, where HR is now freed up to work on more complicated issues and disparities and creating fair workplaces and really addressing with DEI and getting deeper in the culture, because they now have better capacity to do that.
Hmm.
Um, and I also think, and a lot of issues in workplaces where women still carry unfair, heavy admin burdens that are non-promotable work that
Mm.
stunt their careers. This can take that off the table and free them up to engage in other types of work. So it's a double-edged sword. I think I've heard so many different statistics, where they're saying, oh, it's going to kill this many jobs, but then I'm also seeing where it's going to create millions of new jobs, better jobs, jobs where we can engage the world in a very different way.